Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of our CPD series presented by the Banking and Finance Department of ENSafrica. Some of you may have joined us for our last session on POP year, which I think was very helpful to many people. And today our focus is on the conduct standard for banks. For those of you that don't know, ENSafrica is the largest full-service law firm in Africa. We have 12 fully integrated offices across 7 African countries, which enables us to offer multidisciplinary, cross-border and in-country expertise to our clients. We also have a very large banking and finance department within the firm, made up of over 50 practitioners with a deep specialization in all aspects of this area. Within this, we have a financial services team, of which myself and Talia are members. Financial services team also has quite a wide range of expertise and a deep specialization, enabling us to service our clients from startup fintechs to financial conglomerates. ENSafrica is an accredited CPD provider through the FBI. So this webinar today is accredited for CPD points or CPD hours, and if you attend, you will be able to earn 1 CPD hour. This is a verifiable activity. So what that means is that we need to be able to objectively verify that you have been in attendance for the duration of the webinar. So it's quite important that if you are attending for CPD hours and you do wish to receive a CPD certificate of attendance, that you remain logged on for the duration of the webinar. Please don't log off halfway through, because if you do so, we will not be able to issue you with your CPD attendance certificate. Of course, if you're not here for CPD hours and you find our content incredibly boring, you can log off at any time. The other important thing to say about the CPD certificates is that we do need your ID number to be able to issue the certificate to you. When you RSVP'd for this webinar, there was a form that you filled out and it asked you for your ID number, which you most probably filled in. But if there are any attendees who, for some reason, did not fill in their ID number, but do wish to receive the CPD hour of attendance and the certificate evidencing that, then please do email my colleague, Talia Cullinan. You would have seen her email address on the slide previously, and she will make sure that we have your ID number and that we will be able to issue you with a certificate. Before we get into the webinar, maybe just one other housekeeping point. We would like this to be more of a workshop, so we'd like to take your questions as we go and not leave them for the end. If we can ask that you please put your questions in the Q&A block that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put them in the chat. The reason for that is that if they're in the Q&A block, we can get a report of the questions at the end, which enables us to come back to you if we're not able to answer your question during the session. So if we run out of time or your question is very specific and will be best answered via email, then we will do so after the session, and we need you to have used the Q&A block in order to enable us to do that. So just a reminder, please, of that. Then the slides will be available afterwards, so you don't need to worry about taking screenshots. We will send the slides to all of the attendees, and this webinar is also being streamed live currently on our YouTube channel, and will also remain available on the ENSafrica YouTube channel, so that if you wish to refer colleagues to the webinar, they will be able to watch it after today. Of course, watching it after today will not result in you getting CPD hours, just to be clear on that, but the content will at least be available. Let me check if I've told you everything that I needed to tell you from the housekeeping perspective. Yes, I think that is all of that. All right. So before I put the slides up and move into the presentation itself, perhaps just to introduce myself and Talia Cullinan, who will be speaking with me today. I'm an executive in the Banking and Finance Department and the Financial Services team. And I see we've got our exit slide up already. In any event, so I'm an executive in the Banking and Finance Department, with a specialization in financial services and a particular interest in regulatory change. So the last decade and a half have been a good time to be in practice for me, considering the amount of regulatory change that the industry has needed to deal with. And I've been able to help work with clients to future-proof their businesses and to ensure that they are ready for the regulatory changes that have happened over that time and that are still coming. Talia Cullinan is an associate who works closely with me and my team. Talia is also very interested in financial services regulation, with a particular interest in advertising and social media, and of course the banking conduct standard, which we're going to be talking about today. So let's hope that technology is on my side. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Right. There we go. Hopefully the slides are now up for everybody to see. So perhaps to start, let's just contextualize ourselves before we start getting into the detail of the conduct standard. The conduct standard, as you all know, was published on the 3rd of July 2020, but it certainly was not published into a vacuum. I was listening to an interview that Kedibone Dekokwe, who is the divisional executive for the conduct of business supervision, an interview that she gave at the time that the conduct standard was published. And the interviewer asked her, how can the FSCA be bringing in new legislation in the middle of a pandemic while we're all just trying to survive? And her response, which is absolutely correct, as you can see from this slide, was that this piece of legislation has been a long time in the works and has been coming for some time. It's not something new that was cooked up whilst everybody was working remotely. So historically, there has been quite limited regulatory oversight over banks insofar as their conduct and the relationship between the bank and the bank's customer. Of course, in 2002, the FASE Act was promulgated, which started conduct regulation. And to the extent that bank services fell within the definitions of that act, the definitions of financial services, then that would have, of course, been regulated to the extent that it was not exempt. But that didn't cover the full range of conduct and the full interaction between a bank and its customer. 2005, the NCA extended conduct regulation and implemented credit protection provisions and dealing with the provision of credit by banks. But still, conduct supervision was not complete. And in the decade between 2008 and 2018, there were various inquiries into conduct weaknesses in the South African banking sector, culminating in the retail banking diagnostic, which identified poor customer outcomes and set out some recommendations for the regulator to implement to ensure that customers were treated fairly. With the Twin Peaks model having been approved in 2011, that was essentially the start of the two regulators, as we all know. The Twin Peaks model advocates for two separate regulators, a conduct regulator that's separate from the prudential regulator, or the prudential authority, and that is the FSCA, the conduct regulator, and the Financial Sector Regulatory Act, promulgated in 2017, established those two regulators and also expanded the FSCA's mandate to be more proactive, to allow the FSCA to be more intrusive in its conduct regulation of all financial institutions, including banks. In December 2018, we saw the first draft of the COFI bill, the Conduct of Financial Institutions bill. And that bill essentially is the sister bill to the FSRA, the Financial Sector Regulatory Act, in that it adds in the conduct regulation under the architecture or the umbrella created by the FSRA. That bill set out various principled provisions to deal with the 6 TCF outcomes and to make sure that these were achieved for financial customers by financial institutions. The bill went through quite an intensive commenting period, which closed up in April 2019. And it was around that time that the draft conduct standard for banks was first published. The draft conduct standard for banks really is very much written or drawn from the same place as the COFI bill, and it encapsulated, again, is based on the 6 TCF outcomes, and encapsulated these principles that the COFI bill, when it eventually becomes an act, will bring about and will implement for all financial institutions. So while the Kofi bill is, I guess, in a sense, still a work in progress, we of course got the second draft in September 2020, and there was a second round of commenting. But that bill is, of course, not yet law. In the meantime, the conduct standard for banks moved at a faster pace, being submitted to Parliament in February 2020 and then eventually being published in July last year. And what's very interesting about the conduct standard for banks, of course, it's very relevant to banks themselves and for their interactions with their customers, but it's also relevant to financial institutions in general, as it shows us the direction in which Kofi will go. And it really is a forerunner of the types of changes to business and business model amendments that financial institutions will need to make to ensure that they comply with the principles encapsulated now in the conduct standard for banks, and in the future will be encapsulated in Kofi. So that's really just to give some context and to stress the point that the conduct standard for banks was not promulgated in a vacuum. It is the result of a lot of work that's been done by the regulator and a lot of interrogation as to the outcomes for customers in the South African banking sector. I'm going to hand over to Talia now to just give us a bit of an introduction to the conduct regulation suggested by the conduct standard.
Thanks, Jess. So as Jess mentioned, the main purpose of the conduct standard is to bring home familiar concepts within the financial legislation sphere and apply them directly to banks. Now, this of course influence and have an impact on the governance and culture in banks. So Section 3 of the Conduct Standard, which is already in force and which we won't really discuss today, since we're only focusing on the provisions that are going live in July, the Section 3 sets out provisions that specifically relate to governance and culture. The purpose of briefly mentioning it today is that this Conduct Standard acts as an overarching provision that ties in with the monitoring of a bank's compliance with conduct standards, including those going live in July. For example, Section 3.6 of the Conduct Standard states that the monitoring and the evaluation by a bank of its governance arrangements must specifically consider the systems, processes, procedures, and internal control mechanisms in place to ensure compliance with the conduct standards in general and other applicable legislation, as well as the effectiveness of the bank's practices in relation to the fair treatment of its financial customers. This fair treatment, of course, includes and links to our discussion today, namely those regarding disclosures, complaints, and the termination of services either by the bank or by a financial customer. The FSCA has mentioned in its consultation report on the conduct standard that the governance and culture are the cornerstones of good conduct, and it's critical that the FSCA is able to regulate the banks in this regard. Since the final implementation of the Kofi bill is still a few years off, it may be hopefully not just a year, it is therefore, according to the FSCA, not practical to wait for the implementation of the Kofi bill before governance standards are introduced to banks. To manage the compliance with these requirements of the conduct standard, banks are now expected to design and implement the appropriate governance arrangements, policies, and procedures, as well as other control mechanisms that will ensure the fair treatment of customers, is central to their organizational structure. The effect thereof is to ensure accountability of the banks, as banks are required to demonstrate to the FSCA that fair outcomes for customers are consistently delivered in providing financial services and financial products. So that said, the conduct standard is essentially divided in two parts. The first of provisions that are already live and in force, and this we won't be discussing today. These include provisions relating to advertising, product design, and governance and culture. We are going to focus on the provisions going live in July, which are the provisions set out in Section 7 to Section 10 of the Conduct Standard. And this brings me to the first provision, namely that of disclosure. Next, Jess. So the provisions regarding disclosures have been set out in Section 7 of the Conduct Standard, and generally requires banks to give proper thought and consideration of the nature and complexity of the financial product and service provided by them, along with other various factors factors when making disclosures to financial customers and retail financial customers. Purpose here of Section 7 is to ensure that a financial customer will have the useful information at hand and at the appropriate point in time upon making decisions to or entering into or using or maintaining products and services with the bank. This provision ties in with the fourth TCF outcome, namely that where advice is given, it is suitable and takes account of the customer's circumstance. So subsection 1 of Section 7 of the Conduct Standard states that before, during, and after the conclusion of a contract for the provision of financial products or services, a bank must take reasonable steps to ensure that a financial customer is aware of all the relevant facts that could reasonably be expected to influence the financial customer's decision relating to such product or service. These steps include a balanced presentation of benefits and risks of the product, all estimated or service, all estimated costs to the financial customer in respect to the supply of the financial product or services, which will include the total expected or actual costs incurred by the customer, as well as the total or expected returns earned by such financial customer. The third step is that the contractual obligations of financial customers and the bank must be included in the disclosure, the consequences for each party upon breach, as well as the recourse options available to a financial customer in the case of a dispute. There was some kickback seen from the industry in the consultation report as to this, specifically in relation to the disclosure standards applying during, before, and after the conclusion of the contract. It was rather proposed by the industry that the obligation should only exist during the existence of a contract. The FSCA, however, countered this proposal by retaining the before, during, and after wording, as it ties in with the requirement in subsection 3 of Section 7 to make the disclosures at the appropriate time for the financial customer to be able to make an informed decision. Under subsection 2, Jess, you can move over to the next slide, thanks. Yes, so under subsection 2, to make certain disclosures to financial customers and retail financial customers, subsection 2, looks at the disclosure content to be made to financial customers and retail financial customers. So there is a distinction made within the conduct standards between financial customers and specifically retail financial customers, which is defined under Section 1 as any natural person or any juristic person whose material asset value or annual turnover is less than the threshold value in terms of Section 6(1) of the Consumer Protection Act, which currently stands at 2 million. So essentially, the nature and content of your disclosure in the case of a retail financial customer specifically must use plain language and promote the understanding of the financial product or service being provided by the bank. In addition to these two requirements, the nature and content of your disclosure to all your financial customers, regardless if it's a retail financial customer or not, must also be adequate, appropriate, timely, relevant, and complete, factually correct and not misleading, not deceptive, fraudulent, contrary to public interest, and cannot contain any incorrect statements. And finally, it must also be readily available to the financial customer affected by an agreement. In making these disclosures, subsection 3 lists the factors which the banks must consider. These include the nature and complexity of the financial products and services, the needs and reasonably assumed level of knowledge, understanding, and experience of a financial customer at whom the disclosure is targeted, as well as the most appropriate timing of the disclosure concerned. This is to ensure that our financial customer is given the appropriate information about a product or service at the point in time at which the information will be most useful to the customer's decision-making in relation to entering into, using, maintaining the financial product or service. So in essence, an interesting balance comes into play within the conduct standards and specifically in this disclosure provision. The banks are giving some discretion to decide what is appropriate and when it is appropriate to disclose certain information to a financial customer. But simultaneously, when applying that discretion, they are also responsible to be aware of the assumed level of knowledge and understanding and experiences of a financial customer when assessing what and when information must be provided. We note that these disclosures, again, are not new in the financial legislation sphere. In fact, FAIS and the General Code of Conduct also sets out similar disclosure requirements. These include that financial providers must make adequate disclosures of relevant information, and accordingly, a financial customer must be able to make informed decisions and that the product is suitable and appropriate to their needs. Other examples are that information provided must be factually correct, adequate, and appropriate, that information must be provided timelessly as to afford the client to make an informed decision. And these include taking into account factually established and reasonably assumed knowledge of the client. The industry requested that the wording of the conduct standard be aligned to that of FAIS and the General Code of Conduct, as raised in the consultation report. The FSCA, however, mentioned as a reply that the requirements applicable to banks in place in terms of the FAIS and the General Code of Conduct, as well as other relevant pieces of legislation, will still apply to the banks in addition to the requirements set out in the conduct standard. Finally, subsection 4 relates to where a financial product provides for the payment of interest by the banks to the financial customer. Sorry, just you can move over to the next slide. In this case, under section 4, a bank must, in addition, and with equal prominence to any other disclosure regarding the interest rate concerned, must appropriately describe the rate of interest and the disclosure to a financial customer, the effective annual interest rate of the financial product. There we go. It is important to note that this disclosure requirement also applies to any advertising done by the bank, where the advertisement includes a reference to interest payable by the bank to a financial customer in respect of such financial products or services. This you will see in subsection 6.4 of the conduct standard, which is already live and in effect. Finally, subsection 5 states that the FSCA may determine the manner and form of disclosures that must be made in respect of a financial product and financial services relating to retail financial customers only. Over and above those already listed in subsection 2, namely the plain language and the promotion of understanding of the financial product, the FSCA may publish such further guidance, or we can expect such further guidance in this regard. This is especially so since the FSCA noted in its consultation report that it is in the process of considering the development of a more detailed disclosure framework to be applied across all financial institutions under the COFI bill. I'm handing over to Jess to discuss the next provisions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Talia. And just perhaps before we move on to customer complaints, just a reminder that if you do want to ask questions, please drop them in the Q&A block and we will answer them as we go in between the sections. You don't have to hold them till the end. So the other important section that will be coming live in July 2021 is the section dealing with complaints. So what the conduct standard requires is that there is a complaints management framework adopted by the bank. And this framework essentially must deal with and ensure that complainants, being the people who bring complaints, are treated fairly at all times. The conduct standard sets out prescribed aspects that need to be dealt with by the complaints management framework, and businesses would need to consider these and ensure that their framework is broad enough and comprehensive enough to substantively talk to all of these requirements. But when drafting or preparing the framework, what is important, and this is a principle that comes through in the COFI bill as well, is that the framework can be proportional to the business at hand. So, for example, a smaller banking business would need a different type of complaints management framework to a bigger business that's part of a larger financial conglomerate. So proportionality can be applied in developing the complaints management framework. It's also important that the complaints management framework be appropriate for the business model and for the customers of that bank. So, for example, when we look at appropriate channels through which complaints may be lodged or through which customers may be through which banks may communicate with their customers, these channels need to be appropriate taking into account the customers, both the existing customers and the potential customers who are to be targeted pursuant to the business model of that bank. Of course, there must be no unreasonable barriers to complaints, and that again goes to an analysis of the target audience or the target customer base of the bank, the business of the bank, and the way that the bank infiltrates its customer base. It needs to be possible for the customer base to easily raise complaints and for them not to be precluded from doing so because of the manner in which complaints need to be raised or the manner in which the bank deals with complaints. So the complaints management framework needs to be appropriate and fit for purpose. One of the aspects to be dealt with in the management framework is the complaints process. So of course, the complaints process needs to be set out internally and worked out and then documented in the complaints management framework. But looking at it really from a customer-centric point of view or a conduct point of view, which is our focus today, the process that the bank adopts must then be transparent, visible, and accessible to the customers of that bank. So again, this is the specific pool of customers that that bank is targeting, and ensuring that those customers are able to understand the complaints process, understand how they may raise complaints, and have certainty as to how those complaints will be dealt with by the bank. Again, there is the requirement for plain language. So Talia spoke briefly about plain language before when we think about the disclosures that need to be made under the conduct standard. And plain language is defined in the conduct standard. And what's interesting about the definition is that it asks the bank or the financial institution, because as we mentioned, these definitions are going to pull through the COFI bill to apply to all financial institutions. But what's very interesting about the definition is it asks the financial institution or the bank to, when thinking about the language that's used to communicate with customers, to take into account either the established knowledge of a specific customer base or the assumed knowledge of an average person targeted. So that really is a directive from the conduct regulator to financial institutions not to assume knowledge on the part of their customers, not to present information in a dense way or a way in which it would only be understood by a particularly qualified person or someone with a certain level of financial literacy. There's an obligation on the financial institution itself to take that into account when thinking about the language that it uses, and that's pertinently so in the complaints process. Then, of course, the other requirement that comes through is the obligation to acknowledge receipt of a complaint within a reasonable time. Now, that ties into this idea of where does the complaint come from? So if the appropriate channels of complaint, for example, include social media, it would become very important to ensure that the financial institution or the bank has an ability to control that channel as a channel through which it may receive complaints and to then deal with those complaints in accordance with its complaints management framework. I see we do have a question in the question block, so I'm just going to, okay, so this is actually a very helpful question because it's going to lead into my next slide. So Liska has asked us, does the complaints management framework only apply to complaints, as in only negative comments, or is it applicable to a broader service of customers and resolution of issues? So that's a great question. I'm just going to move on to the next slide to answer that question, if my computer will cooperate. There we go. So yes, oh no, there we go. So the complaints management framework deals with complaints made by a complainant. So not just any negative sentiment expressed towards the bank or the financial institution, but actually a complaint that's been lodged. So what you see on the screen is the definition of complainant and the definition of a complaint. And we'll work through both of those now because they're quite relevant to try and delineate the huge possible realm of information, sentiment, expression, customer feedback that a bank may receive. And I think it's important to delineate that so that the complaints management framework can be successfully applied to that which it should apply to. So as you can see from the definition of a complainant is a person. So again, any person, not necessarily someone who is a customer, a person who has submitted a specific complaint. So a specific complaint would be something. So again, that what's important to note there is the specificity, not a general expression of dissatisfaction. A specific complaint to a bank, and the person must either be a financial customer or a potential financial customer, and they must have a direct interest in the financial product or the service to which their complaint relates. Or alternatively, it could be, the complaint could be submitted on behalf of the customer or the potential financial customer. And obviously that's been included to ensure that advocates for customers can submit complaints on their behalf, or whether that's a family member or a professional advocate who might be interested in assisting the customer to bring their complaint to the bank's attention. But what is important is that the person making the complaint needs to be a customer, a financial customer, or a potential financial customer. The complaint must be specific, and it must directly relate to or specific to a financial product or financial service to which that customer or potential customer has an interest. When we talk about potential financial customer within this definition of a complainant, that is narrowed further. So the potential financial customer will only be a complainant to the extent that the complaint relates to that potential financial customer's dissatisfaction with one of the activities that sits within the definition of potential financial customer. And I've put that there for you between square brackets to try and help with the reading. And really that is, in shorthand, what that means is if a potential financial customer has either themselves approached a bank to become a customer and then experienced something which they wish to complain about in relation to the product that they've approached the bank in respect of, or the financial the service in respect of which they've approached the bank. So either it's an approach by a potential financial customer, or that potential financial customer has been solicited by the bank, or they have received advertising material in respect of the bank and its products and services. So of course, the first one is easy to manage because that would be a person approaching the bank through the various channels, whether it be in branch or through online, etc. So that's, I think, easy to delineate who that person is. A person solicited is, of course, also easier to delineate because there's an act of solicitation there by the bank itself. But a customer who has received advertising material in relation to the bank is perhaps a bit more difficult to narrow down. And that then goes back to the provisions of the conduct standard, which talk about advertising. And of course, those are not the focus of our discussion today, but the point to take away from that is that the conduct standard requires a bank to be quite specific and quite mindful in its advertising. So advertising campaigns need to be focused to target customers within a specific group that have been identified by the bank as being appropriate, as an appropriate audience for the product or the service which the bank has developed and which the bank is marketing. If the bank is mindful in the targeted marketing of its products and services, then the risk, of course, of a potential financial customer being someone completely outside of the realm that the bank was seeking to target is lessened. And so therefore, thinking about the marketing of products is important not only to ensure compliance with the advertising provisions of the conduct standard and the disclosure provisions that Talia mentioned, but also to manage risk under the complaint provisions as well. If we then look at the definition of a complaint itself, so it's an expression of dissatisfaction by a person to the bank or to the knowledge of the bank to the bank service provider. And that's an important addition because it essentially makes banks responsible for their service providers and for complaints that are lodged about the bank's products or services via the service provider, but only to the extent that the bank has knowledge of that. However, having said that, the bank is required to monitor the complaints processes of the service providers that the bank uses and to manage, well, to have insight into and be responsible for the complaints management framework of the service provider insofar as it relates to the bank's products and services. So one can't wash your hands of something that happens when the service provider is selling the bank's products or soliciting investment for the bank's products. The bank would be responsible for that as well. And again, that mirrors one of the principles that came through in the first draft of COFI, which is that all financial institutions are responsible for the activities and the conduct of the service providers which they use to distribute their financial products into the market. So an expression of dissatisfaction by a person to a bank or to the bank service provider relating to the financial product or financial service provided or offered, regardless of whether it comes together with a query. And what that expression of dissatisfaction needs to relate to is further then narrowed in the bullets that you can see on the slide. So it would be a complaint. Well, the subject matter would amount to a complaint if the allegation is that the bank or the service provider has either contravened the contractual agreement with the client, or a law or a conduct standard or some other code of conduct to which the bank subscribes or which is binding on the bank, or the bank or its service provider have been negligent or willful in failing to act and have therefore caused the complainant harm, prejudice, distress, or the bank, and this is the broad one, the bank or its service provider has treated the person unfairly. So it's not any general expression of negative sentiment. It needs to fall within the definition of a complaint, and it needs to be made by a person who falls within the definition of a complainant in order for it to need to be dealt with under the complaints management framework. Okay, I see that someone is saying that they can't see the presentation. Talia, can I just ask you to put a thumbs up if you can see the presentation?
Okay, well, I can definitely see it.
Can you see it? Okay. All right. Brad, sorry, I think it might just be you because I think everybody else can see the presentation. All right, then the next question, we've also received another question in the Q&A, which actually, again, thank you, links in nicely to the next slide. So the question we've received is, who can occupy the position of the complaints management executive? Can it be an operations executive, for example, other executives or managers, and what background must this person have? I'm going to move to the next slide to answer that question. Right, okay. Oops, no, too far. There we go. Okay, so we'll get to that question as we move through this slide. The complaints management framework, as mentioned, really links into the governance requirements of the bank. And when conceptualizing the complaints management framework, of course, the TCF outcomes need to be taken into account. And what needs to be paramount is ensuring that customers are treated fairly through the complaints process, and that there's, of course, transparency, there's predicted outcomes, etc. All of the requirements that we know are necessary in ensuring that customers, including complainants, are treated fairly. The complaints management framework needs to be regularly reviewed. And the responsibility for that, for the complaints, for reviewing the complaints management framework and for ensuring that complaints are dealt with or managed in accordance with that framework, sits with the governing body of a bank. Albeit that the governing body may delegate that requirement or that responsibility to an appropriate person. And this is really where the question comes in, is who is an appropriate person? So the person to whom that can be delegated and who will then be responsible for making decisions and recommendations in relation to complaints, that person needs to be someone of an appropriate level of seniority. It also needs to be someone who is able to avoid conflicts within the bank itself. So someone who's able to act impartially in ensuring that the complaints management framework is implemented and that complaints that are managed through that framework are appropriately dealt with in accordance with the prescripts of that framework. So there are some requirements around that person and who they need to be. They also need to have, so obviously seniority, impartiality, ability to act without fear or favor, so not subject to any conflicts. And they need to have appropriate expertise in customer complaint management, experience in that, and also in the content. So knowledge around the financial products of the bank itself and the financial services that are rendered by the bank. So those are some of the requirements that are applicable to that person. But if the governing body of the bank feels that the person that they have identified meets those requirements, then that person can be the delegatee and can be responsible for that. I'm just quickly checking the questions to see that we've answered that one. Okay, there has been a question about the ombud. We will come to that question shortly. So I have noted that one. Okay, and I can see that we've responded to Brad. Okay, perfect. So one of the other aspects that the code of the conduct standard for banks requires with regard to complaints is that when managing complaints and receiving complaints from complainants, banks need to be quite proactive in doing so. So you need to categorize the complaints among certain subcategories. So, for example, it's important to know whether the complaint relates to a financial product, whether it relates to the business model, whether it relates to customer service in branch. There are specific categories set out in the conduct standard, but in fact, the conduct standard requires a bank to analyze its own business model and again, ensure that the categories that it chooses are appropriate for its business model and for its target customers. Once the categories are set out, then all complaints that are collected must be categorized according to the categories. And this is important for recordal purposes, reporting purposes up into the governing body, and also analysis. And I think that's perhaps one of the major shifts from how complaints were dealt with previously to how complaints are to be dealt with going forward. The conduct standard really wants banks to collect this data, store it, consider it, analyze it, and extract from it trends, using those trends then to proactively change the business model of the bank or change the specific product if there's an issue with the product, change the processes to try and address any risk areas or negative areas that are identified through a trend that comes through when considering the complaint. So that's quite a proactive analysis that's necessary, quite an in-depth consideration of the complaints, more so than just having to deal with them and process them and ensure that the customers are treated fairly. It's an extra level or requirement. If a complaint comes through that is complex or unusual, there should be a specific escalation process built into the complaints management framework, which will allow that complaint to short circuit up the chain and be dealt with separately, or at least noted separately. There needs to be review processes to where such a complaint does move through the framework, that complaint can be analyzed and any learnings from that fed back into the business. I think I've mentioned already data capturing, so the conduct standard requires quite a lot of data capture to be done in respect of the complaints, for this to be stored and kept, analyzed, reported back into the governing body, and also for the complaints management framework to be reactive to this when it is renewed, reviewed and renewed on an annual basis. We've spoken about proactively identify and manage conduct risks. And finally, the last bullet on this page, transparency and accessibility of process to the complainant. So that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's very important that the complainants themselves are able to understand what the process is and that the process is transparent. To answer the question about the ombud and where does the ombud fit in? So the ombud, and maybe it's important to answer that question on this slide, because when we talk about the person who internally within the bank is responsible for ensuring that complaints are managed within the complaints management framework, the conduct standard expressly says not to call that person an internal ombud or make any reference to the ombud. The bank's complaint process internally is a separate process to be followed. Once that process has been followed, in accordance with the complaints management framework, if the complainant is not happy with the resolution of the complainant may still approach the ombud. And of course, there are obligations, as there have always been, on the bank to ensure that the complainant knows about the ombud and how to get in touch with the ombud. So that's a secondary process that the complainant can follow. That process remains as it currently is. That would be an external process once this internal process has been completed. Of course, sometimes complainants go directly to the ombud and the ombud would then refer them back to the bank for the complaint to be resolved in accordance with the complaints management framework. To answer the question, there was a question around How does this tie in with the code, with the banking code, the code of banking practice? This is separate to that, but I do think that there are lots of similarities. And of course, banks have, through the code of banking practice, from a self-regulatory point of view, often regulated much of this themselves and ensured that customers were treated fairly. Those principles are in accordance with the principles that come through in the conduct standard for banks. So the conduct standard of banks is, of course, binding legislation, binding on everybody, whether you choose to subscribe or not. The code of banking practice is a code to which banks subscribe voluntarily to ensure good treatment for their customers, or fair treatment for their customers. Okay, there are two more questions, but we'll come to those once we've moved a bit further through the slides. So talking about the Ombud, the Banking Ombud has recently released the 2020 annual report, and it's probably relevant just to stop on that here, just to really just talk about the amount of complaints received and the areas in which complaints are received. And what was the interesting takeaway from the Ombud report is that in 2020, there was a 19.2% increase in formal cases opened. So there is still quite a lot of work to be done in ensuring that customers are treated fairly and that there is that conduct regulation happens appropriately. You can see from the one, I don't know what to call this petal of the flower, this black petal here, that most of the complaints received, or the largest volume of complaints received by the Ombud, related to current accounts, internet banking fraud, credit card, ATM, and there were ATM related complaints, and then quite a few insurance complaints. What the Ombud does in the report is obviously analyze what complaints were received and report back on how the Ombud managed to resolve those complaints. But what's important for our purposes and what's interesting to take away from the Ombud's report is the TCF outcomes compliance, because the Ombud measures the complaints received against the TCF outcomes to see which of the TCF outcomes are weak. So where the service levels are weakening and where attention needs to be focused. And that's, I think, quite interesting, because in a sense, that's exactly what the conduct standard requires banks to do internally as well when categorizing complaints. So the exercise that the Ombud has done is the exercise that a bank would do internally to see where the weaknesses are in its conduct and where it can improve. From the Ombud report, one can see that the weaknesses really relate to clear information. That was the primary issue. Delivery on expectations. So that is one of the TCF outcomes, which requires that a product, that the client's expectations of how a product will perform are equal to how the product actually performs. And then finally, suitability of design, so that the product was suitably designed for the target audience to which it was sold. Another interesting indicator, which we've just added to the slide, is so BrandZeye has put out, BrandZeye has put out a banking index report as well, which analyzed the amount of social media posts about banks. And you can see there from the purple number on the screen that it's a large number of posts come through social media. So you'll recall that I mentioned earlier whether social media is an appropriate channel for complaints, and certainly the way that most banks communicate with their customers now using social media as a marketing tool suggests that social media is certainly an appropriate channel for a customer to also file a complaint with the bank relating to that bank's conduct. So you can see there are very many social media posts about banks, and the graph shows you the response rate to the conversations going on social media around banks, around complaints received via that channel about the bank's conduct. It's an interesting aspect to think about, because I think historically complaints have always been dealt with formally through more formal channels than social media, which, if we are thinking about creating accessibility for target customers, we're thinking about ways to ensure that target customers are able to not experience barriers to complaint. Social media is an obvious channel but it obviously poses risks for banks and difficulties for banks in managing the volume of communication and discussion that goes on via those channels. Brands Eye did a similar thing to the Ombud in looking at the complaints against the TCF outcomes. And what was interesting from their report and what can be seen from their report is that whilst a lot of the complaints received via the social media channels contained TCF themes, they were not responded to by the banks. And that's possibly because they're lost in the conversation or lost in the huge overload of information on social media channels. But this does demonstrate to us that complaints, or at least expressions of dissatisfaction, which may amount to a complaint, are being shared via those channels. And that's perhaps something for banks to consider in putting their complaints management framework in place, is how they will manage and man those channels. Just maybe a quote from Caroline De Silva from a while ago, so in her previous position, but just to point out that the FSCA also sees TCF conversation on social media as relevant. So it's not really that this is something to be disregarded. It's very much the mode of communication, and it's perhaps the easiest way for the majority of customers, target customers of banks, to raise their complaints if they have complaints relating to conduct. So important to take that new channel into account. Before we move on to the next section, I'm just going to quickly check the Q&A box to see if we have missed any questions that we should have been answering. All right, so here's a question around what should businesses be doing now to prepare for COFI? Is it likely there'll be significant changes from the last draft, and will there be a period of implementation? So that's a really good question. I mean, it's perhaps not a question we can answer fully now. There's quite a lot that businesses can be doing to prepare for COFI. But of course, the issue is that it is a draft. The second draft did change quite substantially from the first draft, although the principles didn't change. So I do think that it is wise for businesses to consider the principles, and the principles that are encapsulated in the conduct standard for banks, and that we're discussing now. Certainly those principles we know are the important, we know those are principles that will continue to be law, and COFI will bring them in for other financial institutions because they're based on the TCF outcomes. And of course, they have been made law for banks. There's no reason why they would not be made law for other financial institutions under the COFI umbrella. So those principles, certainly I think businesses can take as given and can take into account to some degree in preparing for COFI. There will be a period for implementation. Both previous drafts contained transitional provisions and a phasing in approach. So there absolutely will be a period for that, and there will be time to upscale at that point or adapt at that point to ensure compliance. Okay. Okay, Audrey, thank you very much. Audrey Grobelaar from BASA has given us just an extra response for me to add there. I think some of you can see it in the chat, but just in case anyone has missed it, the Code of Banking Practice is being reviewed to align it with the current requirements. They are aware that it's not fully aligned with the conduct standard, etc. Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. That's very helpful. All right, let's move on then to Section 9 of the Conduct Standard for Banks, which deals with the refusal, withdrawal, or closure of financial products or services by a bank.
Sorry, Jess. Just there's one question that was raised lower down as to the prescribed response periods for the different categories of complaints. I'm not sure if you'd like to address that now.
Thanks, Talia. Thank you very much. Yes, thanks for that question. So the response period, it's quite interesting. So the conduct standard talks about, I should find the exact words for you, but the conduct standard talks about there must be a reasonably timeous response to complaints. So there isn't a prescribed specific response period for different categories of complaints, but that would be specified, that level of detail would be specified in your complaints management framework in a court, and when looking at the complaints management framework and how it deals with the different categories of complaints, there would be, I would imagine, because the principle is that complainants must always be treated fairly, there will be categories of complaints that are more urgent to respond to than others, although any response time would obviously need to be reasonably timeous in accordance with the principles set out in the conduct standard. To answer that question. Thanks, Talia. That looks like we've answered them all now. All right, so refusal, withdrawal, or closure of financial products or services by a bank. Section 9. Okay. So the conduct standard requires that a bank has a documented policy that sets out the circumstances in which the bank would terminate a relationship with a customer or refuse to establish a relationship with a customer. That process needs to be clearly documented and set out, and then of course it needs to be followed. The contractual relationship that is established between the customer and the bank needs to talk to that process. So the actual contract that the customer signs when first establishing a business relationship with the client, first establishing a business relationship with the bank, needs to set out the reasons for which and the circumstances in which the bank may withdraw services or products, terminate the relationship, or refuse to enter into further products or service contracts with that client. This sounds very simple and very logical, but I think in practice it's something to consider from a compliance perspective, to review the terms and conditions of the various products and to ensure that those terms and conditions and the processes set out therein, so essentially what the customer has seen in the contractual documents, that links in and aligns with the process that's actually followed operationally. So for example, if there were specific reasons why a bank might refuse to establish a relationship with a new client, or may freeze or stop the relationship with a client, and those reasons were not ones driven by law, so were not, for example, lack of FICA compliance, but were softer reasons that that bank may have formulated for themselves, and that is in the internal policies, that needs to come through in the terms and conditions that the client signs, to ensure that there's no mismatch there. That's something just to consider, because that would need to be done to ensure that there's compliance with the requirements of the conduct standard. Then reasonable prior notice needs to be given of any termination, subject to a proviso, which we'll get to, but in the ordinary course, if the proviso or the exception doesn't apply, reasonable prior notice needs to be given to the customer, as well as reasons for the decision to either terminate or withdraw from the customer. So again, that needs to be built into the policy and the procedures to be followed when terminating a relationship with the customer. It's also important from a risk management perspective that be done to ensure that, number one, customers are treated fairly and consistently, and number two, to ensure that there isn't potential reputational or other damage or potential liability for the bank should it not follow the documented process and not provide the customer with the required notice and reasons for the decision. There are exceptions to this, of course, because there are instances where it will not be appropriate to give prior notice to the customer of the termination. And the exceptions are when the bank is compelled by law to terminate the relationship. So, for example, if there is non-compliance with FICA, that would be an example of when the bank is compelled by law, or if the bank has a reasonable suspicion that the product or services are being used for an illegal purpose. So there must be a reasonable suspicion. It doesn't have to be known, it doesn't have to be absolutely proven, but it needs to be a reasonable suspicion. And obviously you can imagine that in that instance, if, for example, there is a suspicion of illegality, it wouldn't make sense to give prior notice to the customer, as this may frustrate the work, for example, of the MPA or some other regulatory authority vis-a-vis that customer. So either compelled by law, then no notice needs to be given. Or if you have a reasonable suspicion of an illegal purpose, then no prior notice needs to be given. So either of those two exceptions need to be present. And in addition to whichever of those two exceptions is present, the bank must report to the relevant authority. So I think it's important to note that the report needs to be done. If the report is not done, and that's probably most times a suspicious transaction report to the FIC or some other report if it's appropriate, depending on what the issue is. But the report needs to be done in order for the exception to apply. So the customer's relationship, if you terminate the relationship, with it to be a corresponding report to the FIC in respect of that. If that's not the case, then you should have given reasonable prior notice, as the exception didn't apply. I see we have a question, which I'm going to just try and open. Okay, so the question is, what is considered a reasonable prior notice? Is it 30 days? Can the client request immediate termination of their product? So I'm going to leave Talia to answer the second part about the client requesting immediate termination, because in the next section, she's going to talk about this from the client's perspective. But what is considered reasonable notice from the bank's perspective is, again, it's a bit of a value judgment based on what is considered fair treatment. So there may be scenarios where 30 days is not appropriate and is not necessarily treating the customer fairly to only give them 30 days, particularly if, for example, you were going to terminate relationship across the entire banking group and the customer would end up not being able to have any banking products, then perhaps 30 days is too short a notice period. But of course, if you are doing so because of being compelled to by law, then 30 days is more than you are required to give in that scenario. So that really is something to be decided by the business as to what the business believes is appropriate and consistent with the principle of treating the customer fairly whilst meeting regulatory requirements. And that principle and that time period that's considered reasonable should be included in the documented policy that's adopted, so that any action taken is always in accordance with the policy itself. Okay, let me check if there's one other question here. Okay, so the question here is with regard to the obligation to assist a customer in transferring their products to another bank. What is the extent of a bank's responsibility and how will this be practically realized? So there is an obligation to assist with portability of products. So there is an obligation on a bank to ensure that products are transferable, or that customers are able to transfer, if not the product, then transfer the relationship at least to another product supplier. There again, you need to be guided by the principle of treating the customer fairly in deciding how far you are obliged to go in ensuring the transferability of the product. This also comes in, of course, in the sections dealing with the design of the product. Transferability is something to be taken into account when designing the product. And I know there have been a lot of, certainly in the rounds of industry comment, there were some questions around that and what does that really mean practically, which I'm not sure that we've quite got to the bottom of that yet. The legislation is not completely prescriptive in that regard. Talia, I'm going to hand back over to you to talk about termination or switching of financial products, and also to answer that question around whether a client may do so without notice. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm first just going to address what the conduct standard states in section 10, and then I'll get to answering the question. So the final section in the conduct standard is that of termination or switching financial products or services by the customer. And this forms part or links to the sixth TCF outcome, namely that customers do not face unreasonable post-sale barriers imposed by a financial institution or bank in this regard to change or switch their products. So the conduct standard essentially imposes 5 obligations on banks where a customer elects to terminate their relationship with the bank or switch the product, etc. The first one is that the bank must not impose an unreasonable barrier where a customer requests to terminate their relationship with a bank or either to close or transfer the product or the services to another bank. The FSCA has submitted also in the consultation report that where a financial product is not transferable due to the nature of the product, this requirement would obviously not be applicable, as it only requires that no unreasonable barriers should be imposed. In other words, the requirement is not that there should be no barriers to terminate a relationship. There may be barriers, but they should be reasonable. The second obligation is that banks must assist the customers to close, terminate, or transfer the products or services to another bank when requested to do so. And this essentially brings us to the question raised by the anonymous attendee, whether the client can request immediate termination of their product. And essentially, well, unfortunately, the conduct standard doesn't really give guidance as to the immediate termination or a client can request it to be terminated, but there is nothing that states whether the bank must act in that or upon that request. And I think that actually boils down to the type of product which the client is either requesting to be terminated or to be transferred to a different bank. And it boils down to the nature of the product. For example, if a deposit is received by the bank, upon receipt of the deposit, the bank is immediately a debtor to the client. And in such an event, provided that the client's bank account is probably or hopefully not in the negative, the bank should be able to react immediately to that request. There could be other requests that would obviously require some internal procedures and authorization to occur before the bank can react to that. So I think it sort of boils down to the circumstances at hand, and reasonableness is likely very often a requirement within the conduct standard. So yeah, there's no fixed answer to that one, unfortunately, but I think, I guess looking at TCF outcomes, it should be as soon as possible, given the circumstances. I hope that answers your questions. Let me know if you'd like me to elaborate or clarify anything further. And then moving on to the third obligation is that contractual agreements with the customers must make the provision for circumstances in which the contractual agreement can be terminated or closed by the customer. So the effect of this obligation is that provisions may be sort of slightly onerous on banks, but only in the initial stages of implementing this obligation, and only obviously if this is not already done. So in this, under this obligation, banks must consider, or we suggest that banks should consider, review, and possibly update their contractual agreements with customers, so that these agreements can include your termination processes, the rights and obligations of the customers when wanting to terminate or switch the financial product, as well as the circumstances in which the financial customer may terminate or switch the contractual agreement. So just to reiterate, your termination processes, the rights and obligations, as well as your circumstances under or when a customer can terminate the agreement. If such an agreement contains these three, let's say, provisions, I think, and going back to the question just raised, it will be more easily for the bank to be able to assess whether, or even the customer to assess whether they can immediately terminate or assist with transferring the product to a different bank. The final two obligations before we end our session is in respect of the dormancy of a financial product only. Sorry, just to reiterate, financial product and not services. So banks are required to proactively disclose to customers the effects and implications of maintaining a dormant financial product, as opposed to just closing or terminating the financial product. In addition, banks must have the processes and procedures in place to identify and notify the customers of their dormant financial product and what the customer's options are in relation to such dormant products. We also note that the FSCA has indicated in its consultation report that in assessing a bank's compliance with regard to this requirement of dormancy and noting dormant products to the clients, they are not expected, or banks are not expected to have a uniform approach across the sector in respect of how they should be treating their product dormancy and the closure thereof, which in most cases we understand involves dormant accounts. Rather, the FSCA has said that they will consider the policies and procedures in place by the specific bank when addressing the issue of dormancy. And also the FSCA stated that it will also take into consideration the relevant circumstances of each bank when assessing or looking at the compliance of the bank under these two obligations. So yeah, that's the end of my part of the presentation. Jess, I don't know if we have any.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt you. Before we just move on to dormancy, I think maybe just 2 points to make, just to add to that on the dormancy point that you've just made. The one is that obviously what you are conveying from the consultation paper, FSCA's consultation paper, is again consistent with the COFI principles and the FSRA provisions, which requires that requires the proportional application of the regulation within certain parameters. So again, it's not, none of these principles that are encapsulated in either the conduct standard or in COFI for that matter are necessarily one size fits all principles. The idea or the underlying philosophy of the legislation is to lay down the principle, and then for each financial institution or bank to consider the application of that principle to their own business model and their own target audience or target customer base, and then to satisfy themselves that they are able to meet the principle with the specifics that they agree for their own businesses within the various policies that must be adopted in accordance with the legislation. So that's perhaps the first point just to make around the way in which the principles are to be applied. And it perhaps goes to how we were trying to answer the previous questions around specific timelines, etc. The other point to make about dormancy is that in addition, and it's pertinent to make it about dormancy, but it of course applies to the conduct standard as a whole, is that what's important to note is that the conduct standard doesn't apply to the exclusion of other legislation which applies. So when we talk about dormant accounts, we are still talking about trust property that's being held or managed on behalf of a client by a financial institution. So in addition to the principles set out in the conduct standard, the financial institution or the bank would need to be sure that they are dealing appropriately with that trust property in accordance with their obligations under the Trust Property Act. And what that act will, obviously be affected by COFI once COFI is enacted, but the principle remains that trust property needs to be dealt with in accordance with instructions received from the owner of that trust property. So when the conduct standard says to us that the contractual agreements in place between the bank and its customer must deal with the process, or it must at least disclose to the customer the effects and the implications of the dormant financial product. In addition to that, the contractual relationship needs to deal with if, for example, the dormant product will be moved somewhere or will be dealt with in a certain way. The contractual aspects need to take that into account to ensure compliance with the other legislation, which remains applicable notwithstanding the conduct standard. So really just to make that point in addition to the points that Talia has made. So yes, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just check that we've dealt with all the comments and the questions. I think that we have. Unless anybody else wants to load another Q&A quickly, I think we have dealt with all the questions that were loaded throughout the webinar. And really then, if there are no further questions, perhaps just to remind everybody again that this webinar will be available on the ENSafrica YouTube channel. So if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, you're more than welcome to do so. You're your colleagues will not be able to get CPD attendance certificates for watching this webinar after the fact. But of course, all of you who have remained in attendance for the webinar will be able to get certificates. If there are any issues with ID numbers that were perhaps not originally provided, then please do contact Talia. She'll be able to help you to make sure that your certificate is issued to you. See, there's one question. Okay, we have one last question to deal with before I wrap up. The question that's just come through is, how should unclaimed monies be dealt with once the account has passed the dormancy period, and how long should the money be held as unclaimed? 60 years is the suggestion. So this is again, a difficult question to answer in broad principles. Very much depends on the specifics. So it depends on what you have contractually agreed with your client. Dormant accounts can be dealt with in each financial institution can decide how to deal with dormant accounts, provided that the way that they deal with those accounts does not offend any legislation, including the Trust Property Control Act. So, sorry, I keep saying the Trust Property Control Act. I mean to say the Protection of Funds, sorry, the Protection of Funds Act. Apologies for that. Mind slip. So that however the institution intends to deal with the dormant account, they need to be sure that they are in compliance with the Protection of Funds Act, which deals with trust property, and that you need instructions to alienate that property or to dispose of that property. You need to be in compliance with that, and you need to be sure that you've treated the customer fairly in compliance with the conduct standard. So if the process is appropriately set out, if there is agreement, if there is an instruction, if it's all consistent across the contractual documents with the client and the internal procedures, if the TCF analysis has been done, then the procedure will potentially be appropriate. But it's not possible, unfortunately, to give an exact answer to that question without the specifics of the matter and the circumstances. All right, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Perhaps just to mention that there are some more CPD webinars being presented in this series from the Banking and Finance Department. If you are on our mailing list, you will receive or already have received the invites to those sessions that will be taking place next week. And if they are of interest to you, we hope to see you all there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.